Good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing well as we move into the weekend. Today's Thursday. Tomorrow, we are going to have this time together, but I'm going to use it for another purpose. Today, we'll be finishing chapter 11. We'll be in Mark 11, 27 through 33. And tomorrow, I'm going to have a biblical conversation of current events, uh, the current events that are causing so much tension and division and confusion and anger, outrage. It's a difficult time. Even I don't know if tragic is too strong a word. And you may have wondered why I haven't spoken to this season in the current events of our land. It's because I'm trying to do more listening and praying and really studying and introspection. There's no sense in me adding, no sense in my adding 2 cents to a conversation that, if my 2 cents spring from my own rant or my own anger, my own opinion, my own desires, my own need to defend myself, or defend others, or excuse, or condemn. Uh, I always try to swim back against the current of emotion and popular tide of reaction. I try to swim back to a platform of a biblical understanding. And some of that requires just going back to the basics. And so, again, really this past week, I've been doing a lot more listening and probably what I should be doing more of. And I think we as Christians, if you're a believer, we're called to listen more than we speak. So I'm trying to be more of a listener and ask the Holy Spirit, God's Spirit in me to synthesize what I'm hearing, but all on the basis of a biblical foundation. So tomorrow, I'm going to spend 20 or 25 minutes just sort of going back to a biblical foundation that might be able to inform a way forward, help us with a way forward, and how individually we can be a salve or a redemptive force in a time of, I would say, tragic division and tension in our land. However, I've titled the message Impaled. And it's a teaching time that will just cover just a few short verses from 27 to 33, but it is stuffed with import. And so I've called this message, this teaching session, Impaled. Impaled means I'm stuck on something and I can't wiggle free. And there's a nice ironic twist in today's story as Jesus is now in Jerusalem, meaning this is the week that he will be crucified. And on the Lord's Day, he's crucified on Friday, and on the Lord's Day, the new Lord's Day on Sunday, he will be uh, gloriously raised again to prove that his mission was divine and his authority was divine and his potency is absolute. Uh, until then, during this week, Jesus continues to have times in the temple and in and around the city where he is stamping his identity into the hearts and minds of people who welcome that stamp and those who refuse and reject that stamp. And so I've titled this session Impaled, and then there's a parenthetical, impaled on the horns of a dilemma. Have you ever heard that statement? I'm on the horns of a dilemma. And what it means is, and I've kind of put a little paragraph, if you are on the horns of a dilemma, it means you are having to choose between two things, both of which are unpleasant or difficult. And so, as this narrative plays out, just these few short verses at the end of chapter 11 of Mark, we see that the religious leaders have plotted to impale Jesus on the horns of a dilemma, and then Jesus, in his brilliance and really in the qualification to make decisions, to demand obedience, and to enforce benefits or consequences for that obedience. Who has been granted or what has been granted authority? This is the template for the dilemma. Uh, Authority in this text and in the Greek language is often couched in the same word that means power or potency, especially moral authority, the power to communicate with absolute authority the moral requirements of a people or a peoples. So the dilemma here is precisely authority. And so, as we move from the story and history, we'll actually begin to ask ourselves that same question: to whom or to what do we grant ultimate authority? Who makes the important decisions about our attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs? To whom do we bow a knee in obedience, or to what? And to whom or to what are we entrusting our hope for benefits, or are we concerned about consequences if we are not obedient to that authority? So here we are in verse 27. It's probably Tuesday, depending on your timeline construction of Passion Week. Jesus and the posse came in and got in late Sunday, which would be uh, the first day of the week. And then we saw Monday's activity, maybe Tuesday, depending on there's various timelines presented by various scholars, but this is most likely Tuesday. Uh, and if you remember, we left yesterday's activity with a raucous cleansing of the temple by Jesus in the court of the Gentiles. And then Jesus returns with the disciples the very next day and go right back to the temple. Verse 27, again, they, Jesus and the disciples, entered Jerusalem. As Jesus was walking through the temple area, now in Matthew's account of this same event, this same day's activities, as it begins here, Matthew says that Jesus was teaching in the temple. So Jesus is walking and teaching in the colonnades, which is really a standard practice for a rabbi or a teacher, walking, teaching. People are following and listening. And remember what has happened just the day before. Jesus has come in and done something unprecedented. He has cleansed the temple of unrighteous activity, both extorting the people who have come to the Passover festival, uh, extorting them through the exchange of money necessary to pay the temple tax, and gouging them as to the price of an acceptable sacrifice, particularly doves. So Jesus has cleansed the temple and caused all kinds of consternation. And the people, however, the popular swell of acceptance is very concerning to the religious leaders who are now threatened beyond their own imaginations. So, again, they entered Jerusalem as Jesus was walking, teaching through the temple area. The leading priests, the teachers of the religious law, and the elders came up to him. So this is a contingent of all of the important religious leaders. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin is the group or the collective of those, the Sanhedrin, and to include scribes and other teachers of the law. And they demanded. So what I want you to see here is as we begin, they make demands of Jesus, and they are rightly, I mean, in their own minds, they are rightly indignant. And when Jesus shows up again after cleansing the temple, they don't know what he's up to, but they have to get some answers. And as we see, they are definitely in the mode of preparing a case against him uh, for his execution. As They came up to him in verse 28. They demanded. And what I want you to notice is they make demands and then Jesus makes a demand. They demanded, by what authority? Now, this is the first of four appearances, four uses of this word. So that means just by observation, this is an important theme. And I would argue the most important theme in this conversation, this important conversation. They demanded, by what authority, what exousia, what power are you doing all these things? And who gave you the right to do them? So, what kind of authority and granted by whom? And Jesus returns their question with a question. Verse 29, I will tell you by what authority I do these things if you answer one question. And this is a common way of dialogue and interrogation and discovery in Jewish conversation. Questions followed by questions. I'll tell you by what authority I do these things if you answer one question, Jesus replied. Did John's authority to baptize come from heaven, or was it merely human? And here is Jesus's demand. So he, by his answering a question with a question, and then his imperative, his command, answer me. He is now beginning to turn the table on the horns of this dilemma, because their desire was to hang Jesus up on the horns of the dilemma. By what authority are you doing all these things, and who gave you the right to do them? So there are two options for Jesus in the Pharisees, or the Sanhedrin's mind, including the Pharisees. There are two options, and neither one of them is a good option for Jesus. One option, he would say, hey, this is just the right thing to do. I want to do it, and this is necessary for me to come in here and act this way. And I think they're particularly talking about when the Sanhedrin asks, by what authority do you do these things? They're speaking directly back to the previous day's activity when Jesus cleansed the temple. That is a fresh and raw wound in the psyche and on the landscape of the temple operation. And so there's two options. If Jesus says, hey, but this is just the right thing to do, then they immediately have a case against him, because he's just some rogue coming in and invading God's space and upsetting the system for his own purposes. And then the other option for him is to say, I'm doing this by God's authority, and God gave me the authority to do this. This is divine exousia, divine power, and this is my Father's granting to me. That's also a liability for Jesus in the law's perspective, because Jesus is now claiming equality with God himself. He's claiming oneness with a God who is only one. In a monotheistic system, God is one. Jesus now is claiming to be another. And so that's a blasphemy charge. So this well-constructed, at least in the Sanhedrin's minds, dilemma, it has been designed to capture Jesus on the horns of this dilemma, where either answer is damnable. But Jesus now impales them on their own dilemma. I'll tell you by what authority I do these things if you answer one question. Did John's authority to baptize come from heaven, or was it merely human? Answer me. So it's sort of like the Jeopardy clock. And so here's how Jesus now hangs them up on the same dilemma. This is John the Baptist, and if you remember, John the Baptist is the one who baptized Jesus. Jesus said, this is necessary to fulfill all righteousness. And upon Jesus' baptism, he came up out of the water, and a voice from heaven and the symbol of the Holy Spirit and the dove came down and affirmed not just Jesus, but John's authority to baptize him. Not only that, but the people, the popular sway of the people toward John was that he was indeed a prophet designated by God to do God's work. And so now the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, the scribes, the leading religious figures are impaled on the same dilemma that they have constructed for Jesus. And so Jesus demands an answer. So I love verse 31. It's almost like, could you give us a minute? TV timeout. And I see them in this full chest confrontation of Jesus, and this question is asked, and they demand an answer, and then Jesus demands the counter answer, and then this puffed up chest becomes this sunken shoulders, and they just say, "Hey, could you give us a minute?" So I see them in this holy or unholy huddle, if you will, talking it over to themselves, talking it over among themselves. Verse 31, they talked it over among themselves. If we say, and here's their dilemma, if we say that John's baptism was from heaven, then he will ask why we didn't believe John. And this is particularly as to why didn't they believe John in the baptism of Jesus? Because if John's power was from heaven and his authority was from heaven to baptize Jesus, it's obvious that Jesus is now the one who is also divine, because upon Jesus' baptism, God put his, for lack of a better term, stamp of approval on Jesus. This is my son in whom I'm well pleased. So they would have to, if they affirmed that John's power and authority to baptize was from heaven, then they would have to affirm by implication that Jesus himself was the Messiah. That's one horn of the dilemma, and here's the other horn. But do we dare say, verse 32, that it was merely human? Because they were afraid of what the people would do, because everyone believed that John was a prophet, meaning that John was sent by God, given God's divine authority to represent him in this time, in this place, in the nation of Israel. So if they say that John's authority was merely human, meaning John just did this because he thought it was the right thing to do, then they would go against the popular opinion, and that would further threaten their status and their standing as the preeminence in the religious culture of Israel. They were really people pleasers and afraid of people, which is always a conundrum of its own. So what they are doing now is they're deciding whether or not they are going to speak truthfully what they actually know in their hearts, but will not accept. That Jesus has all the earmarks, all the qualifications. He has got all of the portfolio components required to recognize him as the unique divine Son of God. He spent all this time teaching, performing miracles, showing his mastery, and now in this last week, the Sanhedrin, all the religious leaders, are confronted with their own unwillingness to accept the truth. And they are fearful of losing their status before the people. That's a conundrum. That's a dilemma. That's impaled. So they finally replied in the lamest answer we could ever conjure. We don't know. They are the victims of their own invention. And so Jesus responded, "Then I won't tell you by what authority I do these things." This is the fourth use of exousia right here. So Jesus is not, wiggling away so he can escape to safety. We know that's not true because we know the story looking back. Jesus is simply providing a divine mirror for those who are too hard-hearted to accept the truth, in this case the religious leaders, so that there can be no doubt that Jesus has given them every opportunity to accept what is obviously true. And yet, because of their own fear and desire to hold on to their status and their own fear of the people that they will lose their popular place, they wimp out. And this is so common. By what authority do you live your life? Do you stand and say that Jesus is my Messiah? And he is the one by whom I live my life in obedience to his commands? Or are you afraid that following Jesus and obeying his commands, losing your life for his sake, will cost you too much? Not only that, but you're afraid of the standing you have with people. That if you were to make it known that you are an obedient servant of Jesus Christ, and therefore cast yourself as a countercultural figure based on his life-giving promises to you, and you don't want to give that up. It's really a question of authority. By whose authority do you make decisions? To whose commands do you bend the knee? To the demands of culture, the demands of your own selfish agenda? It's a question I have to ask myself every day, because we're confronted with these opportunities to wimp out every day. William Barclay says this. I love Barclay. And so I want you to, as we finish, I want you to consider this and put your name here. This whole story is a vivid example of what happens to me when I will not face the truth of Jesus as my ultimate authority. I have to twist and wriggle, and in the end, get myself into a position in which I am helplessly involved. So helplessly involved that I have nothing to say, and I shrink. The person who faces the truth may have the humiliation of saying that he or she was wrong, or the peril of standing by it. But at least the future for that person is strong and bright. Whoever wants to save his life, meaning preserve status and preserve standing, will lose it. But whoever loses his or her life for me will surely find it. In Mark chapter 8, Jesus says, loses his or her life for me and the sake of the gospel, the good news that I am the ultimate authority. The person who will not face the truth has nothing but the prospect of deeper and deeper involvement in a situation which renders them helpless and ineffective. Do you ever wonder why you're... No, that's probably not a good way to say it. Do you ever desire to be more fruitful and effective for the kingdom? Then you have to be willing to stand, even to the point of peril, and proclaim with life-giving power and life-giving service that Jesus is your ultimate authority. That by itself is compelling to a world placing authority in all kind of places that turn out to be dead ends and really not even neutral, but deadly. By what authority do you do the things you do? By what authority do you say the things you say? By what authority are you hoping in positive, eternal outcomes in your life? Jesus has already shown himself qualified. The only thing left is in gratitude and humility to bend the knee, acknowledge him as your forgiver, and then rise up and acknowledge him as your Lord as you seek and strain to follow him in obedience. He is the exousia of God unto your salvation, the power of God, the authority of God. All right, so tune in tomorrow. We'll have this biblical conversation about the tragic current events and tension in our land. I'm going to do some more listening between now and then, and I'm interested in your take as well. All right,